There is a form of collapse that does not look like collapse. It does not arrive as chaos. It arrives as continuity. The voice remains. The habits remain. The calendar remains. The body remains functional enough to carry the story forward. The surface holds. What breaks first is not behavior. What breaks first is coherence. The self persists as a name for something that is no longer unified. It continues to speak as if it were singular, because language was built for stable subjects, and the voice inherits that grammar. The mind continues to narrate, because narration is an old mechanism for binding discontinuity into meaning. The person continues to appear, because appearance is the last refuge of structure. The inner fracture is quieter. It is structural. It is the separation of the one who experiences from the one who claims ownership of the experience. It is the gradual loss of the center that once made perception feel like it belonged to someone. This is not an episode. It is not a mood. It is a slow disassembly of the architecture that makes a human being seem like a single thing. What follows is not a diagnosis. It is a map. Not a modern map made for intervention and repair, but an ancient one made for recognition. A way of seeing how the self disintegrates without announcing itself, how it becomes unlivable without becoming visibly broken, how it shifts from being a structure into being a set of functions that imitate a structure. A self is not a feeling. A self is an arrangement. When the arrangement fails, the person does not immediately vanish. The person becomes a theater where roles continue after the audience has left. The first movement is displacement. Displacement is not the loss of identity in any dramatic sense. It is the subtle relocation of where reality is processed. It is the moment when experience no longer lands in the same place. Early on, the world feels immediate. Perception seems to arrive in the center and radiate outward. The self feels like a stable point from which thought, emotion, and intention emerge. Later, the world begins to arrive as if from a distance. Not physical distance, but existential distance. Things are seen, but they do not integrate. Events occur, but they do not settle. Words are heard, but they do not produce contact. The surface of experience becomes clean and flat, like glass. This displacement is often mistaken for numbness, but numbness implies a missing sensation. The displacement described here does not remove sensation. It removes ownership. The world continues. The mind continues. The body continues. What changes is the location of the I inside that continuity. The I begins to float. It stops being the origin of perception and becomes an observer of perception. It stops being the ground of thought and becomes a witness to thought. It stops being the one who decides and becomes the one who watches decisions emerge from somewhere else. At first, this observation feels like clarity. It feels like distance from unnecessary emotion. It feels like a higher vantage point. It can imitate wisdom. This is why it advances without resistance. Because it looks like maturity. Because it resembles detachment, and detachment has always been praised as strength. Because it resembles self-control, and self-control has always been framed as refinement. Because it resembles insight, and insight has always been treated as a form of salvation. The ancient map does not treat it as salvation. It treats it as the beginning of structural loss. The self, as an arrangement, depends on a certain density. It depends on experiences being metabolized into identity. It depends on memory being braided into continuity. It depends on emotion having a place to land. When that density thins, the self becomes porous. It becomes permeable to forces it once held inside a single frame. Displacement creates a new condition. Internal events feel external. Thought arrives like a stranger. Emotion emerges like weather. Desire moves like a foreign current. The person continues to say, "I think" and "I feel," but the inner certainty behind those phrases is gone. The words remain because the vocabulary of personhood is older than the fracture. The deeper displacement becomes, the more the self relies on imitation. It mimics stability through routine, social performance, and predictable language. It learns to produce the signals that convince others, and sometimes convinces itself. This is not deception in the simple sense. It is structural adaptation. The self becomes a mask that keeps functioning when the face beneath it no longer provides a stable anchor. This is the first axis of inner disintegration. The center moves. When the center moves, everything else begins to drift. The mechanism is not mysterious. It is the way any structure collapses when its binding forces weaken. A self is bound by three operations: integration, continuity, and valuation. Integration is the ability to take raw experience and fold it into a coherent identity. Continuity is the ability to link moments into a single temporal line that feels owned. Valuation is the ability to assign weight, meaning, and priority to events, so that life does not become a flat field of equivalent impressions. These operations create the feeling of a stable me. When any one of these weakens, the self begins to thin. When all three weaken, the self becomes a set of disconnected functions. The ancient map treats the self as something closer to a polity than a substance. It is a negotiated order. It is a coalition of drives, memories, fears, and interpretations held together by a central authority that is not a thing, but a process. That authority is attention. Not attention as a practice, and not attention as a skill, but attention as a governing force. The capacity to select what becomes real, to hold it long enough for meaning to form, and to bind it to the story of the self. When attention is stable, reality is stable. When attention fragments, reality fractures. The mechanism of disintegration is therefore a governance crisis. The center loses its ability to command. The coalition becomes autonomous. Drives begin to operate without coordination. Memory stops functioning as a unified archive and becomes a set of disconnected rooms. Perception becomes sharp but unowned. Emotion becomes intense but unintegrated. Thought becomes productive but alien. The person remains capable. This is part of the danger. Many people can operate for years in this condition. They can build careers, maintain relationships, and appear coherent. They can be admired for their composure, because composure can be the outward expression of internal evacuation. In this condition, the self does not collapse into dysfunction. It collapses into performance. The inner authority no longer governs from within. It governs by external reference. The person begins to know themselves through reflection rather than direct experience. Feedback replaces feeling. Appearance replaces presence. Social cues replace inner valuation. The self becomes a project of calibration rather than a ground of being. This shift is often accompanied by a new form of precision. The person can describe themselves more accurately than ever. They can analyze their patterns, name their traits, and predict their responses. They become legible. Legibility is not integration, it is categorization. A disintegrating self often becomes more describable because it has stopped being lived as a unity and has started being observed as a system. The ancient map recognizes this as a threshold. It is the point where the person becomes a curator of themselves. They do not inhabit their inner life. They manage it. This management produces a particular kind of relief. Relief emerges because management reduces unpredictability. It turns inner life into an object. Objects can be controlled. Objects can be organized. Objects can be judged and improved. But once inner life becomes an object, the self loses its last source of immediacy. A self is immediate when it experiences from within. A self is disintegrating when it experiences itself as something to be monitored. This monitoring becomes constant. It becomes the background of consciousness. The person does not only feel, they watch themselves feeling. They do not only think, they watch themselves thinking. They do not only speak, They watch themselves speaking. This second layer is not insight, it is surveillance. Surveillance erodes integration. It breaks the natural flow of experience into a series of interrupted moments, each annotated by the watcher. The watcher grows stronger as the lived center grows weaker. The person becomes a divided field, an observed self that acts, and an observing self that interprets. The ancient map does not treat the observer as the true self. It treats it as a compensatory structure that emerges when the original center loses authority. It is an emergency government. It maintains order at the cost of intimacy with reality. This is the mechanism. The self does not fall apart because something external attacked it. It falls apart because the forces that bound it, attention, continuity, valuation, become too thin to hold the coalition together. The mind adapts by becoming a watcher, a manager, a performer. The self becomes stable in form, while hollow in function. The consequences are not emotional in the simple sense. They are ontological. They change the way reality is experienced. First, perception becomes sharper but less meaningful. When valuation weakens, everything begins to carry the same weight. A sunrise and a transaction, a confession and a headline, grief and a minor inconvenience, all appear on the same plane. The person can still react, but the reactions feel pre-scripted, like gestures rather than events. This produces a strange exhaustion. Exhaustion arises not from intensity, but from flatness. When nothing has inherent weight, the mind must supply weight artificially. It must manufacture significance through effort. Effort becomes constant. Second, time begins to lose its binding quality. Continuity is what makes a life feel like a single arc rather than a set of episodes. When continuity weakens, memory becomes unreliable in a particular way. It may remain detailed, but it loses ownership. The past feels like a set of documents rather than a lived history. The person remembers, but the remembering does not attach to the current self. The past becomes an archive of someone else. The future becomes a plan that belongs to no one. The present becomes a narrow strip, endlessly replaced. In this condition, the person can still tell their story. They can describe their childhood, their successes, their failures. They can recount trauma and joy. But the story becomes external. It becomes a narrative performed for comprehension, not a foundation lived from within. Third, relationships become unstable in a specific way. Relational reality depends on a self that can be present. Presence is not proximity. Presence is a cohesive interior that can meet another cohesive interior. When the self disintegrates, it can still attach. It can still bond, desire, depend, and commit, but it cannot meet. It becomes relationally functional and existentially absent. This absence can manifest as distance, but it can also manifest as intensity. Sometimes the disintegrating self seeks intensity because intensity temporarily restores weight. It makes the world feel real. It creates a spike of valuation. It forces attention to cohere. Intensity becomes a substitute for integration. This can be mistaken for passion. It can be mistaken for depth. It can be mistaken for fate. But on the ancient map, intensity is not evidence of wholeness. It is evidence of starvation. When the self lacks internal density, it seeks external force to compress it back into a temporary unity. Conflict, romance, crisis, risk, and obsession can all serve this function. Then, when the intensity fades, the hollow returns. The person feels the return as betrayal, boredom, or emptiness. But the mechanism is structural. The self was borrowing weight from the event. A fourth consequence emerges. Moral life becomes distorted. Not because the person becomes immoral, but because moral perception depends on valuation and continuity. When valuation flattens and continuity fractures, the sense of responsibility changes. Responsibility does not vanish. It becomes abstract. The person can still care about right and wrong, but caring becomes conceptual. rather than embodied. Ethics becomes a set of positions rather than a lived alignment. This produces a particular kind of severity. The person may sound principled. They may become strict with themselves and others. But the strictness can be an attempt to restore structure externally through rules, because internal structure has thinned. Rules become scaffolding. The person begins to treat life as something that must be maintained through correct arrangement, rather than lived through coherent presence. The ancient map treats this as a late-stage adaptation, external order as compensation for internal collapse. It often looks admirable. It often earns respect. It often produces achievement. It still does not restore the center. As this condition deepens, a fifth consequence appears. Language begins to drift away from experience. The person becomes skilled at explanation, but explanation stops carrying contact. They can articulate nuance and complexity, but the speech feels empty to them. Words become instruments rather than expressions. This drift creates a quiet despair that is difficult to name because it does not feel like sadness. It feels like an absence of reality inside speech. The person speaks and does not hear themselves. They listen and do not receive others. Everything remains intelligible. Nothing remains intimate. This is the most disorienting consequence. Reality continues to function, and the person continues to function. But the quality of being alive becomes thinner, more abstract, more distant. The world becomes a set of surfaces. The self becomes a set of responses. The inner life becomes a control room with no operator. The ancient map ends not with recovery, but with residue. Residue is what remains when a structure has failed, but nothing has replaced it. In the residue state, the self is not gone. It is dispersed. It exists in fragments, in habits, in roles, in memories, in reflexes, in language. It continues to generate a sense of I as a function, the way a body continues to generate heat even when it is exhausted. This I is thinner than the one that existed before displacement. It is sufficient for survival, sufficient for performance, sufficient for continuity of appearance. It is not sufficient for inhabiting reality. The residue state has a particular texture. It is marked by a quiet recognition that no stable ground exists inside experience. Not as a thought, but as a felt condition. The person moves through life with competence while knowing, somewhere beneath the competence, that their inner life is no longer a home, it is a corridor. In this condition, some people seek to rebuild the old self. They search for identity, purpose, meaning, and belonging as if these were missing objects that can be found again. This search often intensifies the disintegration because it reinforces the watcher, the part of the mind that treats the self as a project. Other people surrender to the residue and build a life that is entirely external. Achievement, status, distraction, stimulation, and constant motion. Motion can mask residue because residue becomes more visible in stillness. Stillness reveals the hollow. The ancient map is severe because it does not flatter either response. It treats both as ways of avoiding the central fact. The self was never a substance. It was always a structure, and structures can weaken without anyone noticing until the center has already moved. The map does not offer comfort because comfort would imply that the self is guaranteed. It is not. It also does not offer despair as a virtue. Despair is still a form of valuation, still a way of forcing weight onto what has become flat. The residue state is quieter than despair. It is a kind of neutral exposure. A person in residue can continue to live without dramatic suffering. They can also continue to live without contact. They can move through days that are full and yet not possessed. They can remember their own life as if reading someone else's biography. They can speak with eloquence while hearing nothing in their own voice. They can touch another human being and feel the gesture more than the contact. This is what remains when the self disintegrates. Not nothing, but a human form that continues without the interior density that once made the form feel inhabited. The map ends here because the residue is not a conclusion, it is a condition. It lingers because it does not resolve into a clear event. It remains because the mind prefers narratives, and residue is not a narrative. It is an aftermath that refuses to announce itself as aftermath. The self, in this state, becomes a kind of empty continuity. Life continues to happen. The person continues to be present in the world. The center remains elsewhere.